Section 11 of Chapter 20 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 20, Section 11. The first two readings passed without a division. But on the motion that the bill should be committed, there was a debate in which the right of free speech was most liberally used by opponents of the government. It was idle, they said, to talk about the poor Huguenots or the poor Palatines. The bill was evidently meant for the benefit not of French Protestants or German Protestants, but of Dutchmen, who would be Protestants, Papists, or Pagans for a guilder a head, and who would, no doubt, be as ready to sign the Declaration against Transubstantiation in England as to trample on the cross in Japan. They would come over in multitudes, they would swarm in every public office, they would collect the customs and gauge the beer barrels. Our navigation laws would be virtually repealed. Every merchant ship that cleared out from the Thames or the Severn would be manned by Zealanders and Hollanders and Frieslanders. To our own sailors would be left the hard and perilous service of the Royal Navy. For Hans, after filling the pockets of his huge trunk-hose with our money by assuming the character of a native, would, as soon as a press-gang appeared, lay claim to the privileges of an alien. The intruders would soon rule every corporation. They would elbow our own aldermen off the Royal Exchange. They would buy the hereditary woods and halls of our country gentlemen. Already one of the most noisome of the plagues of Egypt was among us. Frogs had made their appearance even in the royal chambers. Nobody could go to St. James's without being disgusted by hearing the reptiles of the Batavian marshes croaking all round him. And if this bill should pass, the whole country would be as much infested by the loathsome brood as the palace already was. The orator who indulged himself most freely in this sort of rhetoric was Sir John Knight, member for Bristol, a coarse-minded and spiteful Jacobite, who, if he had been an honest man, would have been a non-juror. 2 years before, when Mayor of Bristol, he had acquired a discreditable notoriety by treating with gross disrespect a commission sealed with the great seal of the sovereigns to whom he had repeatedly sworn allegiance, and by setting on the rabble of his city to hoot and pelt the judges. He now concluded a savage invective by desiring that the sergeant of arms would open the doors, in order that the odious roll of parchment, which was nothing less than a surrender of the birthright of the English people, might be treated with proper contumely. Let us first, he said, kick the bill out of the House, and then let us kick the foreigners out of the kingdom. On a division, the motion for committing the bill was carried by 163 votes to 128. But the minority was zealous and pertinacious, and the majority speedily began to waver. Knight's speech, retouched and made more offensive, soon appeared in print without a licence. Tens of thousands of copies were circulated by the post or dropped in the streets, and such was the strength of national prejudice that too many persons read this ribaldry with assent and admiration. But when a copy was produced in the House, there was such an outbreak of indignation and disgust as cowed even the impudent and savage nature of the orator. Finding himself in imminent danger of being expelled and sent to prison, he apologized and disclaimed all knowledge of the paper which purported to be a report of what he had said. He escaped with impunity, but his speech was voted false, scandalous, and seditious, and was burned by the hangman in Palace Yard. The bill which had caused all this ferment was prudently suffered to drop. Meanwhile, the Commons were busied with financial questions of grave importance. The estimates for the year 1694 were enormous. The King proposed to add to the regular army, already the greatest regular army that England had ever supported, 4 regiments of dragoons, 8 of horse, and 25 of infantry. The whole number of men, officers included, would thus be increased to about 94,000. Cromwell, while holding down 3 reluctant kingdoms and making vigorous war on Spain in Europe and America, had never had 2/3 of the military force which William now thought necessary. The great body of the Tories, headed by 3 Whig chiefs, Harley, Foley, and Howe, opposed any augmentation. The great body of the Whigs, headed by Montague and Wharton, would have granted all that was asked. After many long discussions, and probably many close divisions, in the Committee of Supply, the King obtained the greater part of what he demanded. The House allowed him 4 new regiments of dragoons, 6 of horse, and 15 of infantry. The whole number of troops voted for the year amounted to 83,000, the charge to more than 2,5 millions, including about £200,000 for the ordnance. The naval estimates passed much more rapidly, for Whigs and Tories agreed in thinking that the maritime ascendancy of England ought to be maintained at any cost. £500,000 were voted for paying the arrears due to seamen, and 2 millions for the expenses of the year 1694. The Commons then proceeded to consider the ways and means. The land tax was renewed at 4 shillings in the pound, and by this simple but powerful machinery about 2 millions were raised with certainty and dispatch. A poll tax was imposed. Stamp duties had long been among the fiscal resources of Holland and France, and had existed here during part of the reign of Charles II, but had been suffered to expire. They were now revived, and they have ever since formed an important part of the revenue of the state. The hackney coaches of the capital were taxed, and were placed under the government of commissioners, in spite of the resistance of the wives of the coachmen, who assembled round Westminster Hall and mobbed the members. But notwithstanding all these expedients, there was still a large deficiency, and it was again necessary to borrow. A new duty on salt and some other imposts of less importance was set apart to form a fund for a loan. On the security of this fund, £1 million was to be raised by a lottery, but a lottery which had scarcely anything but the name in common with the lotteries of a later period. The sum to be contributed was divided into 100,000 shares of £10 each. The interest on each share was to be 20 shillings annually, or in other words 10%, during 16 years. But 10% for 16 years was not a bait which was likely to attract lenders. An additional lure was therefore held out to capitalists. On 1/40th of the shares, much higher interest was to be paid than on the other 39/40ths. Which of the shares should be prizes was to be determined by lot. The arrangements for the drawing of the tickets were made by an adventurer of the name of Neal, who, after squandering away 2 fortunes, had been glad to become groom porter at the palace. His duties were to call the odds when the court played at hazard, to provide cards and dice, and to decide any dispute which might arise on the bowling green or at the gaming table. He was eminently skilled in the business of this not very exalted post, and had made such sums by raffles that he was able to engage in very costly speculations, and was then covering the ground round the 7 Dials with buildings. He was probably the best adviser that could have been consulted about the details of a lottery. Yet there were not wanting persons who thought it hardly decent in the Treasury to call in the aid of a gambler by profession. By the lottery loan, as it was called, 1 million was obtained. But another 1 million was wanted to bring the estimated revenue for the year 1694 up to a level with the estimated expenditure. The ingenious and enterprising Montague had a plan ready, a plan to which, except under the pressure of extreme pecuniary difficulties, he might not easily have induced the Commons to assent, but which to his large and vigorous mind appeared to have advantages, both commercial and political, more important than the immediate relief to the finances. He succeeded not only in supplying the wants of the state for 12 months, but in creating a great institution which, after the lapse of more than a century and a half, continues to flourish, and which he lived to see the stronghold through all vicissitudes of the Whig party and the bulwark in dangerous times of the Protestant succession. In the reign of William, old men were still living who could remember the days when there was not a single banking house in the city of London. So late as the time of the Restoration, every trader had his own strong-box in his own house, and when an acceptance was presented to him, told down the crowns and caroluses on his own counter. But the increase of wealth had produced its natural effect, the subdivision of labour. Before the end of the reign of Charles II, a new mode of paying and receiving money had come into fashion among the merchants of the capital. A class of agents arose whose office was to keep the cash of the commercial houses. This new branch of business naturally fell into the hands of the goldsmiths, who were accustomed to traffic largely in the precious metals, and who had vaults in which great masses of bullion could lie secure from fire and from robbers. It was at the shops of the goldsmiths of Lombard Street that all the payments in coin were made. Other traders gave and received nothing but paper. This great change did not take place without much opposition and clamour. Old-fashioned merchants complained bitterly that a class of men who 30 years before had confined themselves to their proper functions and had made a fair profit by embossing silver bowls and chargers, by setting jewels for fine ladies, and by selling pistoles and dollars to gentlemen setting out for the continent, had become the treasurers and were fast becoming the masters of the whole city. These usurers, it was said, played at hazard with what had been earned by the industry and hoarded by the thrift of other men. If the dice turned up well, the knave who kept the cash became an alderman. If they turned up ill, the dupe who furnished the cash became a bankrupt. On the other side, the conveniences of the modern practice were set forth in animated language. The new system, it was said, saved both labour and money. 2 clerks seated in one counting-house did what, under the old system, must have been done by 20 clerks in 20 different establishments. A goldsmith's note might be transferred 10 times in a morning, and thus 100 guineas locked in his safe close to the exchange did what would formerly have required 1,000 guineas dispersed through many tills, some on Ludgate Hill, some in Austin Friars, and some in Tower Street. Gradually, even those who had been loudest in murmuring against the innovation gave way and conformed to the prevailing usage. The last person who held out, strange to say, was Sir Dudley North. When in 1680, after residing many years abroad, he returned to London, nothing astonished or displeased him more than the practice of making payments by drawing bills on bankers. He found that he could not go on 'Change without being followed round the piazza by goldsmiths, who with low bows begged to have the honour of serving him. He lost his temper when his friends asked where he kept his cash. "Where should I keep it," he asked, "but in my own house?" With difficulty he was induced to put his money into the hands of one of the Lombard Street men, as they were called. Unhappily, the Lombard Street man broke, and some of his customers suffered severely. Dudley North lost only £50, but this loss confirmed him in his dislike of the whole mystery of banking. It was in vain, however, that he exhorted his fellow citizens to return to the good old practice, and not to expose themselves to utter ruin in order to spare themselves a little trouble. He stood alone against the whole community. The advantages of the modern system were felt every hour of every day in every part of London, and people were no more disposed to relinquish those advantages for fear of calamities which occurred at long intervals, than to refrain from building houses for fear of fires, or from building ships for fear of hurricanes. It is a curious circumstance that a man who, as a theorist, was distinguished from all the merchants of his time by the largeness of his views and by his superiority to vulgar prejudices, should in practice have been distinguished from all the merchants of his time by the obstinacy with which he adhered to an ancient mode of doing business, long after the dullest and most ignorant plodders had abandoned that mode for one better suited to a great commercial society. No sooner had banking become a separate and important trade than men began to discuss with earnestness the question whether it would be expedient to erect a national bank. The general opinion seems to have been decidedly in favour of a national bank. Nor can we wonder at this, for few were then aware that trade is in general carried on to much more advantage by individuals than by great societies. And banking really is one of those few trades which can be carried on to as much advantage by a great society as by an individual. 2 public banks had long been renowned throughout Europe, the Bank of St. George at Genoa and the Bank of Amsterdam. The immense wealth which was in the keeping of those establishments, the confidence which they inspired, The prosperity which they had created, their stability, tried by panics, by wars, by revolutions, and found proof against all, were favourite topics. The Bank of St. George had nearly completed its 3rd century. It had begun to receive deposits and to make loans before Columbus had crossed the Atlantic, before Gama had turned the Cape, when a Christian emperor was reigning at Constantinople, when a Mohammedan sultan was reigning at Granada, when Florence was a republic, when Holland obeyed a hereditary prince. All these things had been changed. New continents and new oceans had been discovered. The Turk was at Constantinople, the Castilian was at Granada, Florence had its hereditary prince, Holland was a republic. But the Bank of St. George was still receiving deposits and making loans. The Bank of Amsterdam was little more than 80 years old, but its solvency had stood severe tests. Even in the terrible crisis of 1672, when the whole delta of the Rhine was overrun by the French armies, when the white flags were seen from the top of the Stadthouse, there was one place where, amidst the general consternation and confusion, tranquillity and order were still to be found, and that place was the Bank. Why should not the Bank of London be as great and as durable as the banks of Genoa and of Amsterdam? Before the end of the reign of Charles II, several plans were proposed, examined, attacked, and defended. Some pamphleteers maintained that a national bank ought to be under the direction of the King. Others thought that the management ought to be entrusted to the Lord Mayor, Aldermen, and Common Council of the capital. After the Revolution, the subject was discussed with an animation before unknown. For under the influence of liberty, the breed of political projectors multiplied exceedingly. A crowd of plans, some of which resemble the fancies of a child or the dreams of a man in a fever, were pressed on the government. Preeminently conspicuous among the political mountebanks, whose busy faces were seen every day in the lobby of the House of Commons, were John Briscoe and Hugh Chamberlain, two projectors worthy to have been members of that academy which Gulliver found at Lagado. These men affirmed that the one cure for every distemper of the state was a land bank. A land bank would work for England miracles such as had never been wrought for Israel, miracles exceeding the heaps of quails and the daily shower of manna. There would be no taxes, and yet the exchequer would be full to overflowing. There would be no poor rates, for there would be no poor. The income of every landowner would be doubled. The profits of every merchant would be increased. In short, the island would, to use Briscoe's words, be the paradise of the world. The only losers would be the moneyed men, those worst enemies of the nation, who had done more injury to the gentry and yeomanry than an invading army from France would have had the heart to do. These blessed effects the Land Bank was to produce simply by issuing enormous quantities of notes on landed security. The doctrine of the projectors was that every person who had real property ought to have, besides that property, paper money to the full value of that property. Thus, if his estate was worth £2,000, he ought to have his estate and £2,000 in paper money. Both Briscoe and Chamberlain treated with the greatest contempt the notion that there could be an over-issue of paper as long as there was for every £10 note a piece of land in the country worth £10. Nobody, they said, would accuse a goldsmith of over-issuing as long as his vaults contained guineas and crowns to the full value of all the notes which bore his signature. Indeed, no goldsmith had in his vaults guineas and crowns to the full value of all his paper. And was not a square mile of rich land in Taunton Dean at least as well entitled to be called wealth as a bag of gold or silver? The projectors could not deny that many people had a prejudice in favour of the precious metals, and that therefore, if the Land Bank were bound to cash its notes, it would very soon stop payment. This difficulty they got over by proposing that the notes should be inconvertible, and that everybody should be forced to take them. End of section 11. Recording by Patrick Wallace.
Chapter 20 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by S.T. Macduff. The History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 20, Section 12. The speculations of Chamberlain on the subject of the currency may possibly find admirers even in our own time, but to his other errors he added an error which began and ended with him. He was fool enough to take it for granted in all his reasonings that the value of an estate varied directly as the duration. He maintained that if the annual income derived from a manor were £1,000, a grant of that manor for 20 years must be worth £20,000, and a grant for 100 years worth £100,000. If, therefore, the lord of such a manor would pledge it for 100 years to the land bank might, on that security, instantly issue notes for £100,000. On this subject Chamberlain was proof to ridicule, to argument, even to arithmetical demonstration. He was reminded that the fee simple of land would not sell for more than 20 years' purchase. To say, therefore, that a term of 100 years was worth 5 times as much as a term of 20 years was to say that a term of 100 years was worth 5 times the fee simple. In other words, that 100 years was 5 times infinity. Those who reasoned thus were refuted by being told that they were usurers, and it should seem that a large number of country gentlemen thought the refutation complete. In December 1693, Chamberlain laid his plan in all its naked absurdity before the Commons, and petitioned to be heard. He confidently undertook to raise £8,000 on every freehold estate of £150 a year, which should be brought, as he expressed it, into his land bank, and this without dispossessing the freeholder. All the squires in the house must have known that the fee simple of such an estate would hardly fetch £3,000 in the market. That less than the fee simple of such an estate could by any device be made to produce £8,000 would, it might have been thought, have seemed incredible to the most illiterate fox-hunter that could be found on the benches. Distress, however, and animosity had made the landed gentlemen credulous. They insisted on referring Chamberlain's plan to a committee, and the committee reported that the plan was practicable and would tend to the benefit of the nation. But by this time the united force of demonstration and derision had begun to produce an effect even on the most ignorant rustics in the House. The report lay unnoticed on the table, and the country was saved from a calamity compared with which the defeat of Landon and the loss of the Smyrna fleet would have been blessings. All the projectors of this busy time, however, were not so absurd as Chamberlain. One among them, William Patterson, was an ingenious, though not always a judicious, speculator. Of his early life little is known, except that he was a native of Scotland, and that he had been in the West Indies. In what character he had visited the West Indies was a matter about which his contemporaries differed. His friends said that he had been a missionary, his enemies that he had been a buccaneer. He seems to have been gifted by nature with fertile invention, an ardent temperament, and great powers of persuasion, and to have acquired somewhere in the course of his vagrant life a perfect knowledge of accounts. This man submitted to the government in 1691 a plan of a national bank, and his plan was favourably received both by statesmen and by merchants. But years passed away and nothing was done, till in the spring of 1694 it became absolutely necessary to find some new mode of defraying the charges of the war. Then at length the scheme devised by the poor and obscure Scottish adventurer was taken up in earnest by Montague. With Montague was closely allied Michael Godfrey, the brother of that Sir Edmundsbury Godfrey whose sad and mysterious death had, 15 years before, produced a terrible outbreak of popular feeling. Michael was one of the ablest, most upright, and most opulent of the merchant princes of London. He was, as might have been expected from his near connection with the martyr of the Protestant faith, a zealous Whig. Some of his writings are still extant, and prove him to have had a strong and clear mind. By these two distinguished men Patterson's scheme was fathered. Montague undertook to manage the House of Commons, Godfrey to manage the City. An approving vote was obtained by the tonnage for the benefit of such persons as should advance money towards carrying on the war. An approving vote was obtained by the Committee of Ways and Means, and a bill, the title of which gave occasion to many sarcasms, was laid on the table. It was indeed not easy to guess that a bill which purported only to impose a new duty on tonnage for the benefit of such persons as should advance money towards carrying on the war was really a bill creating the greatest commercial institution that the world had ever seen. The plan was that £1,200,000 should be borrowed by the government on what was then considered as the moderate interest of 8%. In order to induce capitalists to advance the money promptly on terms so favourable to the public, the subscribers were to be incorporated by the name of the Governor and Company of the Bank of England. The corporation was to have no exclusive privilege, and was to be restricted from trading in anything but bills of exchange, bullion, and forfeited pledges. As soon as the plan became generally known, a paper war broke out as furious as that between the swearers and the non-swearers, or as that between the old East India Company and the new East India Company. The projectors who had failed to gain the ear of the government fell like madmen on their more fortunate brother. All the goldsmiths and pawnbrokers set up a howl of rage. Some discontented Tories predicted ruin to the monarchy. It was remarkable, they said, that banks and kings had never existed together. Banks were republican institutions. There were flourishing banks at Venice, at Genoa, at Amsterdam, and at Hamburg. But who ever heard of a Bank of France or a Bank of Spain? Some discontented Whigs, on the other hand, predicted ruin to our liberties. Here, they said, is an instrument of tyranny more formidable than the High Commission, than the Star Chamber, than even the 50,000 soldiers of Oliver. The whole wealth of a nation will be in the hands of the Tonnage Bank, such was the nickname then in use, and the Tonnage Bank will be in the hands of the sovereign. The power of the purse, the one great security for all the rights of Englishmen, will be transferred from the House of Commons to the governor and directors of the new company. This last consideration really was of some weight, and was allowed to be so by the authors of the bill. A clause was therefore most properly inserted, which inhibited the bank from advancing money to the Crown without authority from the Parliament. Every infraction of this salutary rule was to be punished by forfeiture of 3 times the sum advanced, and it was provided that the King should not have power to remit any part of the penalty. The plan, thus amended, reached the sanction of the Commons more easily than might have been expected from the violence of the adverse clamour. In truth, the Parliament was under duress. Money must be had, and could in no other way be had so easily. What took place when the House had resolved itself into a committee cannot be discovered, but while the Speaker was in the chair, no division took place. The bill, however, was not safe when it reached the Upper House. Some lords suspected that the plan of a national bank had been devised for the purpose of exalting the moneyed interest at the expense of the landed interest. Others thought that this plan, whether good or bad, ought not to have been submitted to them in such a form. Whether it would be safe to call into existence a body which might one day rule the whole commercial world, and how such a body should be constituted, were questions which ought not to be decided by one branch of the legislature. The peers ought to be at perfect liberty to examine all the details of the proposed scheme, to suggest amendments, to ask for conferences. It was therefore most unfair that the law establishing the bank should be set up as part of a law granting supplies to the Crown. The Jacobites entertained some hope that the session would end with a quarrel between the Houses, that the Tonnage Bank would be lost, and that William would enter on the campaign without money. It was already May, according to the new style. The London season was over, and many noble families had left Covent Garden and Soho Square for their woods and hayfields. But summonses were sent out. There was a violent rush back to town. The benches which had lately been deserted were crowded. The sittings began at an hour unusually early, and were prolonged to an hour unusually late. On the day on which the bill was committed, the contest lasted without intermission from 9 in the morning till 6 in the evening. Godolphin was in the chair. Nottingham and Rochester proposed to strike out all the clauses which related to the bank. Something was said about the danger of setting up a gigantic corporation which might soon give law to the King and the 3 estates of the realm. The peers seemed to be most annoyed by the appeal which was made to them as landlords. The whole scheme, it was asserted, was intended to enrich usurers at the expense of the nobility and gentry. Persons who had laid by money would rather put it into a bank than lend it on mortgage at moderate interest. Caermarthen said little or nothing in defence of what was, in truth, the work of his rivals and enemies. He owned that there were grave objections to the mode in which the Commons had provided for the public service of the year. But would their lordships amend a money bill? Would they engage in a contest of which the end must be that they must either yield or incur the grave responsibilities of leaving the Channel without a fleet during the summer? This argument prevailed, and on a division the amendment was rejected by 43 votes to 31. A few hours later the bill received the royal assent, and the Parliament was prorogued. In the City the success of Montague's plan was complete. It was then at least as difficult to raise £1,000,000 at 8% as it would be now to raise 30 millions at 4%. It had been supposed that contributions would drop in very slowly, and a considerable time had therefore been allowed by the Act. This indulgence was not needed. So popular was the new investment that on the day on which the books were opened, £300,000 were subscribed. 300,000 more were subscribed during the next 48 hours, and in 10 days, to the delight of all the friends of the government, it was announced that the list was full. The whole sum which the corporation was bound to lend to the state was paid into the Exchequer before the first instalment was due. Somers gladly put the Great Seal to a charter framed in conformity with the terms prescribed by Parliament, and the Bank of England commenced its operations in the house of the Company of Grocers. There, during many years, directors, secretaries, and clerks might be seen labouring in different parts of one spacious hall. The persons employed by the bank were originally only 54. They are now 900. The sum paid yearly in salaries amounted at first to only £4,350. It now exceeds £210,000. We may therefore fairly infer that the incomes of commercial clerks are, on an average, about 3 times as large in the reign of Victoria as they were in the reign of William III. It soon appeared that Montague had, by skilfully availing himself of the financial difficulties of the country, rendered an inestimable service to his party. During several generations the Bank of England was emphatically a Whig body. It was Whig not accidentally but necessarily. It must have instantly stopped payment if it had ceased to receive the interest on the sum which it had advanced to the government, and of that interest James would not have paid 1 farthing. 17 years after the passing of the Tonnage Bill, Addison, in one of his most ingenious and graceful little allegories, described the situation of the great company through which the immense wealth of London was constantly circulating. He saw public credit on her throne in Grocers' Hall, the great charter over her head, the Act of Settlement full in her view. Her touch turned everything to gold. Behind her seat, bags filled with coin were piled up to the ceiling. On her right and on her left, the floor was hidden by pyramids of guineas. On a sudden, the door flies open. The Pretender rushes in, a sponge in one hand, in the other a sword which he shakes at the Act of Settlement. The beautiful Queen sinks down fainting. The spell by which she has turned all things around her into treasure is broken. The money bags shrink like prickled bladders. The piles of gold pieces are turned into bundles of rags or faggots of wooden tallies. The truth which this parable was meant to convey was constantly present to the minds of the rulers of the bank. So closely was their interest bound up with the interest of the government that the greater the public danger, the more ready were they to come to the rescue. In old times, when the treasury was empty, when the taxes came in slowly, and when the pay of the soldiers and sailors was in arrear, it had been necessary for the Chancellor of the Exchequer to go, hat in hand, up and down Cheapside and Cornhill, attended by the Lord Mayor and by the aldermen, and to make up a sum by borrowing £100 from this hosier and £200 from that ironmonger. Those times were over. The government, instead of laboriously scooping up supplies from numerous petty sources, could now draw whatever it required from an immense reservoir which all those petty sources kept constantly replenished. It is hardly too much to say that, during many years, the weight of the bank, which was constantly in the scale of the Whigs, almost counterbalanced the weight of the Church, which was as constantly in the scale of the Tories. A few minutes after the bill which established the Bank of England had received the royal assent, the Parliament was prorogued by the King with a speech in which he warmly thanked the Commons for their liberality. Montague was immediately rewarded for his services in the place of Chancellor of the Exchequer. Shrewsbury had a few weeks before consented to accept the seals. He had held out resolutely from November to March, while he was trying to find excuses which might satisfy his political friends. Sir James Montgomery visited him. Montgomery was now the most miserable of human beings. Having borne a great part in a great revolution, having been charged with the august office of presenting the crown of Scotland to the sovereigns whom the Estates had chosen, having domineered without a rival during several months in the Parliament of Edinburgh, having seen before him in near prospect the seals of secretary, the coronet of an earl, ample wealth, supreme power, he had, on a sudden, sunk into obscurity and abject penury. His fine parts still remained, and he was therefore used by the Jacobites. But, though used, he was despised, distrusted, and starved. He passed his life in wandering from England to France and from France back to England, without finding a resting place in either country. Sometimes he waited in the antechamber in Saint-Germain, where the priests scowled at him as a Calvinist, and where even the Protestant Jacobites cautioned one another in whispers against the old Republican. Sometimes he lay hid in the garrets of London, imagining that every footstep which he heard on the stairs was that of a bailiff with a writ, or that of a king's messenger with a warrant. He now obtained access to Shrewsbury, and ventured to talk as a Jacobite to a brother Jacobite. Shrewsbury, who was not at all inclined to put his estate and his neck in the power of a man whom he knew to be both rash and perfidious, returned very guarded answers. Through some channel which is not known to us, William obtained full intelligence of what had passed on this occasion. He sent for Shrewsbury, and again spoke earnestly about the secretaryship. Shrewsbury again excused himself. His health, he said, was bad. "That," said William, "is not your only reason." "No, sir," said Shrewsbury, "it is not." And he began to speak of public grievances, and alluded to the fate of the Triennial Bill, which he himself had introduced. But William cut him short. "There is another reason behind. When did you see Montgomery last?" Shrewsbury was thunderstruck. The King proceeded to repeat some things which Montgomery had said. By this time Shrewsbury had recovered from his dismay, and had recollected that in the conversation which had been so accurately reported to the government he had fortunately uttered no treason, though he had heard much. "Sir," said he, "since your Majesty has been so correctly informed, you must be aware that I gave no encouragement to that man's attempts to seduce me from my allegiance." William did not deny this, but intimated that such secret dealings with noted Jacobites raised suspicions which Shrewsbury could remove only by accepting the seals. "That," he said, "will put me quite at ease. I know that you are a man of honour, and that if you undertake to serve me, you will serve me faithfully." So pressed, Shrewsbury complied, to the great joy of his whole party, and was immediately rewarded for his compliance with a dukedom and a garter. End of chapter 20, section 12. Recording by S.T. Macduff. Section 13, chapter 20, of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by S.T. Macduff. The History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 20, Section 13. Thus a Whig ministry was gradually forming. There were now 2 Whig Secretaries of State, a Whig Keeper of the Great Seal, a Whig First Lord of the Admiralty, a Whig Chancellor of the Exchequer. The Lord Privy Seal, Pembroke, might also be called a Whig, for his mind was one which readily took the impress of any stronger mind with which it was brought into contact. Seymour, having been long enough a Commissioner of the Treasury to lose much of his influence with the Tory country gentlemen who had once listened to him as to an oracle, was dismissed, and his place was filled by John Smith, a zealous and able Whig who had taken an active part in the debates of the last session. The only Tories who still held great offices in the executive government were the Lord President, Caermarthen, who, though he began to feel the power was slipping from his grasp, still clutched it desperately, and the First Lord of the Treasury, Godolphin, who meddled little out of his own department, and performed the duties of that department with skill and assiduity. William, however, still tried to divide his favours between the 2 parties. Though the Whigs were fast drawing to themselves the substance of power, the Tories obtained their share of honorary distinctions. Milgrave, who had, during the late session, exerted his great parliamentary talents in favour of the King's policy, was created Marquess of Normandy, and named a cabinet councillor, but was never consulted. He obtained at the same time a pension of £3,000 a year. Caermarthen, whom the late changes had deeply mortified, was in some degree consoled by a signal mark of royal approbation. He became Duke of Leeds. It had taken him little more than 20 years to climb from the station of a Yorkshire country gentleman to the highest rank in the peerage. Two great Whig earls were at the same time created dukes, Bedford and Devonshire. It ought to be mentioned that Bedford had repeatedly refused the dignity which he now somewhat reluctantly accepted. He declared that he preferred his earldom to a dukedom, and gave a very sensible reason for the preference. An earl who had numerous family might send one son to the Temple and another to a counting-house in the city. But the sons of a duke were all lords, and a lord could not make his bread either at the bar or on 'Change. The old man's objections, however, were overcome, and the two great houses of Russell and Cavendish, which had long been closely connected by friendship and by marriage, by common opinions, common sufferings, and common triumphs, received on the same day the greatest honour which it is in the power of the Crown to confer. The Gazette which announced these creations announced also that the King had set out for the Continent. He had, before his departure, consulted with his ministers about the means of counteracting a plan of naval operations which had been formed by the French government. Hitherto the Maritime War had been carried on chiefly in the Channel and the Atlantic. But Louis had now determined to concentrate his maritime forces in the Mediterranean. He hoped that, with their help, the army of Marshal Noailles would be able to take Barcelona, to subdue the whole of Catalonia, and to compel Spain to sue for peace. Accordingly, Tourville's squadron, consisting of 53 men of war, set sail from Brest on the 25th of April and passed the Straits of Gibraltar on the 4th of May. William, in order to cross the designs of the enemy, determined to send Russell to the Mediterranean with the greater part of the combined fleet of England and Holland. A squadron was to remain in the British seas under the command of the Earl of Berkeley. Talmash was to embark on board of the squadron with a large body of troops, and was to attack Brest, which would, it was supposed, in the absence of Tourville and his 53 vessels, be an easy conquest. That preparations were making at Portsmouth for an expedition in which the land forces were to bear a part could not be kept a secret. There was much speculation at the Rose and at Garraway's touching the destination of the armament. Some talked of Rhe, some of Oleron, some of Rochelle, some of Rochefort. Many, till the fleet actually began to move westward, believed that it was bound for Dunkirk. Many guessed that Brest would be the point of attack, but they only guessed this, for the secret was much better kept than most of the secrets of that age. Russell, till he was ready to weigh anchor, persisted in assuring his Jacobite friends that he knew nothing. His discretion was proof even against all the arts of Marlborough. Marlborough, however, had other sources of intelligence. To those sources he applied himself, and he at length succeeded in discovering the whole plan of the government. He instantly wrote to James. He had, he said, but that moment ascertained that 12 regiments of infantry and 2 regiments of marines were about to embark, under the command of Talmash, for the purpose of destroying the harbour of Brest and the shipping which lay there. This, he added, would be a great advantage to England. But no consideration can or ever shall hinder me from letting you know what I think may be for your service. He then proceeded to caution James against Russell. I endeavoured to learn this some time ago from him, but he always denied it to me, though I am very sure that he knew the design for more than 6 weeks. This gives me a bad sign of this man's intentions. The intelligence sent by Marlborough to James was communicated by James to the French government. That government took its measures with characteristic promptitude. Promptitude, indeed, was necessary, for when Marlborough's letter was written, the preparations at Portsmouth were all but complete, and if the wind had been favourable to the English, the objects of the expedition might have been attained without a struggle. But adverse gales detained our fleet in the Channel during another month. Meanwhile, a large body of troops was collected at Brest. Vauban was charged with the duty of putting the defences in order, and under his skilful direction batteries were planted which commanded every spot where it seemed likely that an invader would attempt to land. 8 large rafts, each carrying many mortars, were moored in the harbour, and some days before the English arrived all was ready for their reception. On the 6th day of June the whole allied fleet was on the Atlantic, about 15 leagues west of Cape Finisterre. There Russell and Berkeley parted company. Russell proceeded toward the Mediterranean. Berkeley's squadron, with the troops on board, steered for the coast of Brittany, and anchored just without Camaret Bay, close to the mouth of the harbour of Brest. Talmash proposed to land in Camaret Bay. It was therefore desirable to ascertain with accuracy the state of the coast. The eldest son of the Duke of Leeds, now called Marquess of Caermarthen, undertook to enter the basin and to obtain the necessary information. The passion of this brave and eccentric young man for maritime adventure was unconquerable. He had solicited and obtained the rank of Rear Admiral, and had accompanied the expedition in his own yacht, the Peregrine, renovated as the masterpiece of shipbuilding, and more than once already mentioned in this history. Cutts, who had distinguished himself by his intrepidity in the Irish war, and had been rewarded with an Irish peerage, offered to accompany Caermarthen. Lord Mohun, who, desirous, it may be hoped, to efface by honourable exploits the stain which a shameful and disastrous brawl had left on his name, was serving with the troops as a volunteer, insisted on being of the party. The Peregrine went into the bay with its gallant crew, and came out safe, but not without having run great risks. Caermarthen reported that the defences, of which, however, he had seen only a small part, were formidable. But Berkeley and Talmash suspected that he overrated the danger. They were not aware that their design had long been known at Versailles, that an army had been collected to oppose them, and that the greatest engineer in the world had been employed to fortify the coast against them. They therefore did not doubt that the troops might easily be put on shore under the protection of a fire from the ships. On the following morning, Caermarthen was ordered to enter the bay with 8 vessels and to batter the French works. Talmash was to follow with about 100 boats full of soldiers. It soon appeared that the enterprise was even more perilous than it had on the preceding day appeared to be. Batteries, which had then escaped notice, opened on the ships a fire so murderous that several decks were soon cleared. Great bodies of foot and horse were discernible, and by their uniforms they appeared to be regular troops. The young Rear Admiral sent an officer in all haste to warn Talmash. But Talmash was so completely possessed by the notion that the French were not prepared to repel an attack that he disregarded all cautions, and would not even trust his own eyes. He felt sure that the force which he saw assembled on the shore was a mere rabble of peasants, who had been brought together in haste from the surrounding country. Confident that these mock soldiers would run like sheep before real soldiers, he ordered his men to pull for the beach. He was soon undeceived. A terrible fire mowed down his troops faster than they could get on shore. He had himself scarcely sprung on dry ground when he received a wound in the thigh from a cannonball, and was carried back to his skiff. His men re-embarked in confusion. Ships and boats made haste to get out of the bay, but did not succeed till 400 seamen and 700 soldiers had fallen. During many days the waves continued to throw up pierced and shattered corpses on the beach of Brittany. The battery from which Talmash received his wound is called, to this day, the Englishman's death. The unhappy general was laid on his couch, and a council of war was held in his cabin. He was for going straight into the harbour of Brest and bombarding the town. But this suggestion, which indicated but too clearly that his judgment had been affected by the irritation of a wounded body and a wounded mind, was wisely rejected by the naval officers. The armament returned to Portsmouth. There Talmash died, exclaiming with his last breath that he had been lured into a snare by treachery. The public grief and indignation were loudly expressed. The nation remembered the services of the unfortunate general, forgave his rashness, pitied his sufferings, and execrated the unknown traitors whose machinations had been fatal to him. There were many conjectures and many rumours. Some sturdy Englishmen, misled by national prejudice, swore that none of our plans would ever be kept a secret from the enemy while French refugees were in high military command. Some zealous Whigs, misled by party spirit, muttered that the court of Saint-Germain would never want good intelligence while a single Tory remained in the Cabinet Council. The real criminal was not named, nor till the archives of the House of Stuart were explored was it known to the world that Talmash had perished by the basest of all the 100 villainies of Marlborough. Yet never had Marlborough been less a Jacobite than at the moment when he rendered this wicked and shameful service to the Jacobite cause. It may be confidently affirmed that to serve the banished family was not his object, and that to ingratiate himself with the banished family was only his secondary object. His primary object was to force himself into the service of the existing government, and to regain possession of those important and lucrative places from which he had been dismissed more than 2 years before. He knew that the country and the Parliament would not patiently bear to see the English army commanded by foreign generals. 2 Englishmen only had shown themselves fit for high military posts, himself and Talmash. If Talmash were defeated and disgraced, William would scarcely have a choice. In fact, as soon as it was made known that the expedition had failed, and that Talmash was no more, the general cry was that the King ought to receive into his favour the accomplished captain who had done such good service at Walcourt, at Cork, at Kinsale. Nor can we blame the multitude for raising this cry, for everybody knew that Marlborough was an eminently brave, skilful, and successful officer. But few persons knew that he had, while commanding William's troops, while sitting in William's council, while waiting in William's bedchamber, formed a most artful and dangerous plot for the subversion of William's throne. And still fewer suspected the real author of the recent calamity, of the slaughter in the Bay of Camaret, the melancholy fate of Talmash. The effect, therefore, of the foulest of all treasons was to raise the traitor in public estimation. Nor was he wanting to himself at this conjuncture. While the Royal Exchange was in consternation at this disaster of which he was the cause, while many families were clothing themselves in mourning for the brave men of whom he was the murderer, he repaired to Whitehall, and there, doubtless with all that grace, that nobleness, that suavity, under which lay, hidden from all common observers, a seared conscience and a remorseless heart, he professed himself the most devoted, the most loyal of all the subjects of William and Mary, and expressed a hope that he might, in this emergency, be permitted to offer his sword to their Majesties. Shrewsbury was very desirous that the offer should be accepted, but a short and dry answer from William, who was then in the Netherlands, put an end for the present of all negotiation. About Talmash the King expressed himself with generous tenderness. "The poor fellow's fate," he wrote, "has affected me much. I do not indeed think that he managed well, but it was his ardent desire to distinguish himself that impelled him to attempt impossibilities." The armament which had returned to Portsmouth soon sailed again for the coast of France, but achieved only exploits worse than inglorious. An attempt was made to blow up the pier at Dunkirk. Some towns inhabited by quiet tradesmen and fishermen were bombarded. In Dieppe scarcely a house was left standing. A third part of Havre was laid in ashes, and shells were thrown into Calais, which destroyed 30 private dwellings. The French and the Jacobites loudly exclaimed against the cowardice and barbarity of making war on an unwarlike population. The English government vindicated itself by reminding the world of the sufferings of the thrice wasted Palatinate, and as against Louis and the flatterers of Louis, the vindication was complete. But whether it were consistent with humanity and with sound policy to visit the crimes which an absolute prince and a ferocious soldiery had committed in the Palatinate on shopkeepers and labourers, on women and children, who did not know that the Palatinate existed, may perhaps be doubted. Meanwhile Russell's fleet was rendering good service to the common cause. Adverse winds had impeded his progress through the Straits so long that he did not reach Cartagena till the middle of July. By that time the progress of the French arms had spread terror even to the Escurial. Noailles had, on the banks of the Tar, routed an army commanded by the Viceroy of Catalonia, and on the day on which this victory was won, the Brest squadron had joined the Toulon squadron in the Bay of Rosas. Palamos, attacked at once by land and sea, was taken by storm. Gerona capitulated after a faint show of resistance. Ostalric surrendered at the first summons. Barcelona would, in all probability, have fallen, had not the French admirals learned that the conquerors of La Hogue was approaching. They instantly quitted the coast of Catalonia, and never thought themselves safe till they had taken shelter under the batteries of Toulon. The Spanish government expressed warm gratitude for this seasonable assistance, and presented to the English admiral a jewel which was popularly said to be worth near £20,000 sterling. There was no difficulty in finding such a jewel among the hordes of gorgeous trinkets which had been left by Charles V and Philip II to a degenerate race. But in all that constitutes the true wealth of states, Spain was poor indeed. Her treasury was empty, her arsenals were unfurnished, her ships were so rotten that they seemed likely to fly asunder at the discharge of their own guns. Her ragged and starving soldiers often mingled with the crowd of beggars at the doors of convents, and battled there for a mess of pottage and a crust of bread. Russell underwent those trials which no English commander whose hard fate it has been to cooperate with Spaniards has escaped. The Viceroy of Catalonia promised much, did nothing, and expected everything. he declared that 350,000 rations were ready to be served out to the fleet at Cartagena. It turned out that there were not in all the stores of that port provisions sufficient to victual a single frigate for a single week. Yet His Excellency thought himself entitled to complain because England had not sent an army as well as a fleet, and because the heretic admirals did not choose to expose the fleet to utter destruction by attacking the French under the guns of Toulon. Russell implored the Spanish authorities to look well to their dockyards and to try to have by the next spring a small squadron which might at least be able to float, but he could not prevail on them to careen a single ship. He could with difficulty obtain on hard conditions permission to send a few of his sick men to marine hospitals on shore. Yet, in spite of all the trouble given him by the imbecility and ingratitude of a government which has generally caused more annoyance to its allies than to its enemies, he acquitted himself well. It is but just to him to say that from the time in which he became First Lord of the Admiralty, there was a decided improvement in the naval administration. Though he lay with his fleet many months near an inhospitable shore, and at a great distance from England, there were no complaints about the quality or the quantity of provisions. The crews had better food and drink than they had ever had before. Comforts which Spain did not afford were supplied from home, and yet the charge was not greater than when, in Torrington's time, the sailor was poisoned with mouldy bread and nauseous beer. End of chapter 20, section 13. Recording by S.T. Macduff.
Of chapter 20 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay, Chapter 20, Section 14. As almost the whole maritime force of France was in the Mediterranean, and as it seemed likely that an attempt would be made on Barcelona in the following year, Russell received orders to winter at Cadiz. In October he sailed to that port, and there he employed himself in refitting his ships with an activity unintelligible to the Spanish functionaries, who calmly suffered the miserable remains of what had once been the greatest navy in the world to rot under their eyes. Along the eastern frontier of France the war during this year seemed to languish. In Piedmont and on the Rhine the most important events of the campaign were petty skirmishes and predatory incursions. Louis remained at Versailles and sent his son, the Dauphin, to represent him in the Netherlands. But the Dauphin was placed under the tutelage of Luxembourg, and proved a most submissive pupil. During several months the hostile armies observed each other. The Allies made one bold push with the intention of carrying the war into the French territory, but Luxembourg, by a forced march which excited the admiration of persons versed in the military art, frustrated the design. William, on the other hand, succeeded in taking Huy, then a fortress of the third rank. No battle was fought, no important town was besieged, but the Confederates were satisfied with their campaign. Of the 4 previous years, every one had been marked by some great disaster. In 1690 Waldeck had been defeated at Fleurus. In 1691 Mons had fallen. In 1692 Namur had been taken in sight of the allied army, and this calamity had been speedily followed by the defeat of Steinkirk. In 1693 the Battle of Landen had been lost, and Charleroi had submitted to the conqueror. At length, in 1694, the tide had begun to turn. The French arms had made no progress. What had been gained by the Allies was indeed not much, but the smallest gain was welcome to those whom a long run of evil fortune had discouraged. In England, the general opinion was that, notwithstanding the disaster in Camaret Bay, the war was, on the whole, proceeding satisfactorily both by land and by sea. But some parts of the internal administration excited during this autumn much discontent. Since Trenchard had been appointed Secretary of State, the Jacobite agitators had found their situation much more unpleasant than before. Sidney had been too indulgent and too fond of pleasure to give them much trouble. Nottingham was a diligent and honest minister, but he was as high a Tory as a faithful subject of William and Mary could be. He loved and esteemed many of the nonjurors, and, though he might force himself to be severe when nothing but severity could save the state, he was not extreme to mark the transgressions of his old friends, nor did he encourage talebearers to come to Whitehall with reports of conspiracies. But Trenchard was both an active public servant and an earnest Whig. Even if he had himself been inclined to leniency, he would have been urged to severity by those who surrounded him. He had constantly at his side Hugh Speke and Aaron Smith, men to whom a hunt after a Jacobite was the most exciting of all sports. The cry of the malcontents was that Nottingham had kept his bloodhounds in the leash, but that Trenchard had let them slip. Every honest gentleman who loved the Church and hated the Dutch went in danger of his life. There was a constant bustle at the Secretary's office, a constant stream of informers going in and of messengers with warrants going out. It was said, too, that the warrants were often irregularly drawn, that they did not specify the person, that they did not specify the crime, and yet that, under the authority of such instruments as these, houses were entered, desks and cabinets searched, valuable papers carried away, and men of good birth and breeding flung into gaol among felons. The minister and his agents answered that Westminster Hall was open, that if any man had been illegally imprisoned, he had only to bring his action, that juries were quite sufficiently disposed to listen to any person who pretended to have been oppressed by cruel and griping men in power, and that, as none of the prisoners whose wrongs were so pathetically described had ventured to resort to this obvious and easy mode of attaining redress, it might fairly be inferred that nothing had been done which could not be justified. The clamour of the malcontents, however, made a considerable impression on the public mind, and at length a transaction in which Trenchard was more unlucky than culpable brought on him and on the government with which he was connected much temporary obloquy. Among the informers who haunted his office was an Irish vagabond who had borne more than one name, and had professed more than one religion. He now called himself Taaffe. He had been a priest of the Roman Catholic Church, and secretary to Adda the Papal Nuncio, but had since the Revolution turned Protestant, had taken a wife, and had distinguished himself by his activity in discovering the concealed property of those Jesuits and Benedictines who, during the late reign, had been quartered in London. The ministers despised him, but they trusted him. They thought that he had, by his apostasy, and by the part which he had borne in the spoliation of the religious orders, cut himself off from all retreat, and that, having nothing but a halter to expect from King James, he must be true to King William. This man fell in with a Jacobite agent named Lunt, who had, since the Revolution, been repeatedly employed among the discontented gentry of Cheshire and Lancashire, and who had been privy to those plans of insurrection which had been disconcerted by the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, and by the Battle of La Hogue in 1692. Lunt had once been arrested on suspicion of treason, but had been discharged for want of legal proof of his guilt. He was a mere hireling, and was, without much difficulty, induced by Taaffe to turn approver. The pair went to Trenchard. Lunt told his story, mentioned the names of some Cheshire and Lancashire squires to whom he had, as he affirmed, carried commissions from the Saint-Germain, and of others who had, to his knowledge, formed secret hoards of arms and ammunition. His simple oath would not have been sufficient to support a charge of high treason, but he produced another witness, whose evidence seemed to make the case complete. The narrative was plausible and coherent, and indeed, though it may have been embellished by fictions, there can be little doubt that it was in substance true. Messengers and search warrants were sent down to The alarm had been given by some of the numerous traitors who ate the bread of William. Some of the accused persons had fled, and others had buried their sabres and muskets and burned their papers. Nevertheless, discoveries were made which confirmed Lunt's depositions. Behind the wainscot of the old mansion of one Roman Catholic family was discovered a commission signed by James. Another house, of which the master had absconded, was strictly searched, in spite of the solemn asseverations of his wife and his servants that no arms were concealed there. While the lady, with her hand on her heart, was protesting on her honour that her husband was falsely accused, the messengers observed that the back of the chimney did not seem to be firmly fixed. It was removed, and a heap of blades, such as were used by horse soldiers, tumbled out. In one of the garrets was found, carefully bricked up, 30 saddles for troopers, as many breastplates, and 60 cavalry swords. Trenchard and Aaron Smith thought the case complete, and it was determined that those culprits who had been apprehended should be tried by a special commission. Taaffe now confidently expected to be recompensed for his services, but he found a cold reception at the Treasury. He had gone down to Lancashire chiefly in order that he might, under the protection of a search warrant, pilfer trinkets and broad pieces from secret drawers. His sleight of hand, however, had not altogether escaped the observation of his companions. They discovered that he had made free with the communion plate of the Popish families, whose private hoards he had assisted in ransacking. When therefore he applied for reward, he was dismissed, not merely with a refusal, but with a stern reprimand. He went away, mad with greediness and spite. There was yet one way in which he might obtain both money and revenge, and that way he took. He made overtures to the friends of the prisoners. He, and he alone, could undo what he had done, could save the accused from the gallows, could cover the accusers with infamy, could drive from office the secretary and the solicitor, who were the dread of all the friends of King James. Loathsome as Taaffe was to the Jacobites, his offer was not to be slighted. He received a sum in hand. He was assured that a comfortable annuity for life should be settled on him when the business was done, and he was sent down into the country and kept in strict seclusion against the day of trial. Meanwhile, unlicensed pamphlets, in which the Lancashire plot was classed with Oates's plot, with Dangerfield's plot, with Fuller's plot, with Young's plot, with Whitney's plot, were circulated all over the kingdom, and especially in the county which was to furnish the jury. Of these pamphlets the longest, the ablest, and the bitterest, entitled A Letter to Secretary Trenchard, was commonly ascribed to Ferguson. It is not improbable that Ferguson may have furnished some of the materials, and may have conveyed the manuscript to the press, but many passages are written with an art and a vigour which assuredly did not belong to him. Those who judge by internal evidence may perhaps think that, in some parts of this remarkable tract, they can discern the last gleam of the malignant genius of Montgomery. A few weeks after the appearance of the letter, he sank, unhonoured and unlamented, into the grave. There were then no printed newspapers except the London Gazette. But since the Revolution the newsletter had become a more important political engine than it had previously been. The newsletters of one writer named Dyer were widely circulated in manuscript. He affected to be a Tory and a High Churchman, and was consequently regarded by the fox-hunting lords of manors all over the kingdom as an oracle. He had already been twice in prison, but his gains had more than compensated for his sufferings, and he still persisted in seasoning his intelligence to suit the taste of the country gentleman. He now turned the Lancashire plot into ridicule, declared that the guns which had been found were old fowling pieces, that the saddles were meant only for hunting, and that the swords were rusty relics of Edge Hill and Marston Moor. The effect produced by all this invective and sarcasm on the public mind seems to have been great. Even at the Dutch embassy, where assuredly there was no leaning towards Jacobitism, there was a strong impression that it would be unwise to bring the prisoners to trial. In Lancashire and Cheshire the prevailing sentiments were pity for the accused and hatred of the prosecutors. The government, however, persevered. In October 4 judges went down to Manchester. At present the population of that town is made up of persons born in every part of the British Isles, and consequently has no especial sympathy with the landowners, the farmers, and the agricultural labourers of the neighbouring districts. But in the 17th century the Manchester man was a Lancashire man. His politics were those of his county. For the old Cavalier families of his county he felt a great respect, and he was furious when he thought that some of the best blood of his county was about to be shed by a knot of Roundhead pettifoggers from London. Multitudes of people from the neighbouring villages filled the streets of the town, and saw with grief and indignation the array of drawn swords and loaded carbines which surrounded the culprits. Aaron Smith's arrangements do not seem to have been skilful. The chief counsel for the Crown was Sir William Williams, who, though now well stricken in years and possessed of a great estate, still continued to practise. One fault had thrown a dark shade over the latter part of his life. The recollection of that day on which he had stood up in Westminster Hall amidst laughter and hooting to defend the dispensing power and to attack the right of petition had, ever since the Revolution, kept him back from honour. He was an angry and disappointed man, and was by no means disposed to incur unpopularity in the cause of a government to which he owed nothing, and from which he hoped nothing. Of the trial no detailed report has come down to us, but we have both a Whig narrative and a Jacobite narrative. It seems that the prisoners who were first arraigned did not sever in their challenges, and were consequently tried together. Williams examined, or rather cross-examined, his own witnesses with a severity which confused them. The crowd which filled the court laughed and clamoured. Lunt, in particular, became completely bewildered, mistook one person for another, and did not recover himself till the judges took him out of the hands of the counsel for the Crown. For some of the prisoners an alibi was set up. Evidence was also produced to show, what was undoubtedly quite true, that Lunt was a man of abandoned character. The result, however, seemed doubtful till, to the dismay of the prosecutors, Taaffe entered the box. He swore with unblushing forehead that the whole story of the plot was a circumstantial lie devised by himself and Lunt. Williams threw down his brief, and in truth a more honest advocate might well have done the same. The prisoners who were at the bar were instantly acquitted, and those who had not yet been tried were set at liberty. The witnesses for the prosecution were pelted out of Manchester. The clerk of the Crown narrowly escaped with his life, and the judges took their departure amidst hisses and execrations. A few days after the close of the trials at Manchester, William returned to England. On the 12th of November, only 48 hours after his arrival at Kensington, the Houses met. He congratulated them on the improved aspect of affairs. Both by land and by sea, the events of the year which was about to close had been, on the whole, favourable to the allies. The French armies had made no progress. The French fleets had not ventured to show themselves. Nevertheless, a safe and honourable peace could be obtained only by a vigorous prosecution of the war, and the war could not be vigorously prosecuted without large supplies. William then reminded the Commons that the Act by which they had settled the tonnage and poundage on the Crown for 4 years was about to expire, and expressed his hope that it would be renewed. After the King had spoken, the Commons, for some reason which no writer has explained, adjourned for a week. Before they met again, an event took place which caused great sorrow at the palace, and through all the ranks of the Low Church party. Tillotson was taken suddenly ill while attending public worship in the chapel of Whitehall. Prompt remedies might perhaps have saved him, but he would not interrupt the prayers, and, before the service was over, his malady was beyond the reach of medicine. He was almost speechless. But his friends long remembered with pleasure a few broken ejaculations which showed that he enjoyed peace of mind to the last. He was buried in the church of St. Lawrence Jewry, near Guildhall. It was there that he had won his immense oratorical reputation. He had preached there during the 30 years which preceded his elevation to the throne of Canterbury. His eloquence had attracted to the heart of the city crowds of the learned and polite, from the Inns of Court, and from the lordly mansions of St. James's and Soho. A considerable part of his congregation had generally consisted of young clergymen who came to learn the art of preaching at the feet of him who was universally considered as the first of preachers. To this church his remains were now carried through a mourning population. The hearse was followed by an endless train of splendid equipages from Lambeth through Southwark and over London Bridge. Burnet preached the funeral sermon. His kind and honest heart was overcome by so many tender recollections that, in the midst of his discourse, he paused and burst into tears, while a loud moan of sorrow rose from the whole auditory. The Queen could not speak of her favourite instructor without weeping. Even William was visibly moved. "I have lost," he said, "the best friend that I ever had, and the best man that I ever knew." The only Englishman who is mentioned with tenderness in any part of the great mass of letters which the King wrote to Heinsius is Tillotson. The Archbishop had left a widow. To her William granted a pension of 400 a year, which he afterwards increased to 600. His anxiety that she should receive her income regularly and without stoppages was honourable to him. Every quarter-day he ordered the money, without any deduction, to be brought to himself, and immediately sent it to her. Tillotson had bequeathed to her no property except a great number of manuscript sermons. Such was his fame among his contemporaries that those sermons were purchased by the booksellers for an almost incredible sum of 2,500 guineas, equivalent, in the wretched state in which the silver coin then was, to at least £3,600. Such a price had never before been given in England for any copyright. About the same time Dryden, whose reputation was then in the zenith, received £1,300 for his translation of all the works of Virgil, and was thought to have been splendidly remunerated. It was not easy to fill satisfactorily the high place which Tillotson had left vacant. Mary gave her voice for Stillingfleet, and pressed his claims as earnestly as she ever ventured to press anything. In abilities and attainments he had few superiors among the clergy, but, though he would probably have been considered as a low churchman by Jane and South, he was too high a churchman for William, and Tenison was appointed. The new primate was not eminently distinguished by eloquence or learning, but he was honest, prudent, laborious, and benevolent. He had been a good rector of a large parish, and a good bishop of a large diocese. Detraction had not yet been busy with his name, and it might well be thought that a man of plain sense, moderation, and integrity was more likely than a man of brilliant genius and lofty spirit to succeed in the arduous task of quieting a discontented and distracted church. End of section 14. Of chapter 20 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay, chapter 20, section 15. Meanwhile, the Commons had entered upon business. They cheerfully voted about £2,400,000 for the army and as much for the navy. The land tax for the year was fixed again at 4 shillings in the pound. The Tonnage Act was renewed for a term of 5 years, and a fund was established on which the government was authorised to borrow £2.5 millions. Some time was spent by both Houses in discussing the Manchester trials. If the malcontents had been wise, they would have been satisfied with the advantage which they had already gained. Their friends had been set free. The prosecutors had with difficulty escaped from the hands of an enraged multitude. The character of the government had been seriously damaged. The ministers were accused in prose and in verse, sometimes in earnest and sometimes in jest, of having hired a gang of ruffians to swear away the lives of honest gentlemen. Even moderate politicians, who gave no credit to these foul imputations, owned that Trenchard ought to have remembered the villainies of Fuller and Young, and to have been on his guard against such wretches as Taaffe and Lunt. The unfortunate Secretary's health and spirits had given way. It was said that he was dying, and it was certain that he would not long continue to hold the seals. The Tories had won a great victory, but, in their eagerness to improve it, they turned it into a defeat. Early in the session Howe complained with his usual vehemence and asperity of the indignities to which innocent and honourable men, highly descended and highly esteemed, had been subjected by Aaron Smith and the wretches who were in his pay. The leading Whigs, with great judgment, demanded an inquiry. Then the Tories began to flinch. They well knew that an inquiry could not strengthen their case, and might well weaken it. The issue, they said, had been tried, a jury had pronounced, the verdict was definitive, and it would be monstrous to give the false witnesses who had been stoned out of Manchester an opportunity of repeating their lesson. To this argument the answer was obvious. The verdict was definitive as respected the defendants, but not as respected the prosecutors. The prosecutors were now in their turn defendants, and were entitled to all the privileges of defendants. It did not follow, because the Lancashire gentleman had been found, and very properly found, not guilty of treason, that the Secretary of State or the Solicitor of the Treasury had been guilty of unfairness or even of rashness. The House, by 119 votes to 102, resolved that Aaron Smith and the witnesses on both sides should be ordered to attend. Several days were passed in examination and cross-examination, and sometimes the sittings extended far into the night. It soon became clear that the prosecution had not been lightly instituted, and that some of the persons who had been acquitted had been concerned in treasonable schemes. The Tories would now have been content with a drawn battle, but the Whigs were not disposed to forego their advantage. It was moved that there had been a sufficient ground for the proceedings before the special commission, and this motion was carried without a division. The opposition proposed to add some words implying that the witnesses for the Crown had forsworn themselves, but these words were rejected by 136 votes to 109, and it was resolved by 133 votes to 97 that there had been a dangerous conspiracy. The Lords had meanwhile been deliberating on the same subject, and had come to the same conclusion. They sent Taaffe to prison for prevarication, and they passed resolutions acquitting both the government and the judges of all blame. The public, however, continued to think that the gentlemen who had been tried at Manchester had been unjustifiably persecuted, till a Jacobite plot of singular atrocity, brought home to the plotters by decisive evidence, produced a violent revulsion of feeling. Meanwhile 3 bills, which had been repeatedly discussed in preceding years, and 2 of which had been carried in vain to the foot of the throne, had been again brought in: the Place Bill, the Bill for the regulation of trials in cases of treason, and the Triennial Bill. The Place Bill did not reach the Lords. It was thrice read in the Lower House, but was not passed. At the very last moment it was rejected by 175 votes to 142. Howe and Barley were the tellers for the minority. The bill for the regulation of trials in cases of treason went up again to the Peers. Their Lordships again added to it the clause which had formerly been fatal to it. The Commons again refused to grant any new privilege to the hereditary aristocracy. Conferences were again held, reasons were again exchanged, both Houses were again obstinate, and the bill was again lost. The Triennial Bill was more fortunate. It was brought in on the first day of the session, and went easily and rapidly through both Houses. The only question about which there was any serious contention was how long the existing Parliament should be suffered to continue. After several sharp debates, November in the year 1696 was fixed as the extreme term. The Tonnage Bill and the Triennial Bill proceeded almost side by side. Both were, on the 22nd of December, ready for the royal assent. William came in state on that day to Westminster. The attendance of members of both Houses was large. When the Clerk of the Crown read the words, "A bill for the frequent calling and meeting of Parliaments," the anxiety was great. When the Clerk of the Parliament made answer, le roi et la reine le volant. A loud and long hum of delight and exultation rose from the benches in the bar. William had resolved many months before not to refuse his assent a second time to so popular a law. There was some, however, who thought that he would not have made so great a concession if he had on that day been quite himself. It was plain, indeed, that he was strangely agitated and unnerved. It had been announced that he would dine in public at Whitehall, but he disappointed the curiosity of the multitude which on such occasions flocked to the court, and hurried back to Kensington. He had but too good reason to be uneasy. His wife had during 2 or 3 days been poorly, and on the preceding evening grave symptoms had appeared. Sir Thomas Millington, who was physician in ordinary to the King, thought that she had the measles. But Radcliffe, who, with coarse manners and little book learning, had raised himself to the first practice in London chiefly by his rare skill in diagnostics, uttered the more alarming words, smallpox. That disease, over which science has since achieved a succession of glorious and beneficent victories, was then the most terrible of all the ministers of death. The havoc of the plague had been far more rapid, but the plague had visited our shores only once or twice within living memory, and the smallpox was always present, filling the churchyards with corpses, tormenting with constant fears all whom it had not yet stricken, leaving on those whose lives it spared the hideous traces of its power, turning the babe into a changeling at which the mother shuddered, and making the eyes and cheeks of the betrothed maiden objects of horror to the lover. Towards the end of the year 1694 this pestilence was more than usually severe. At length the infection spread to the palace, and reached the young and blooming Queen. She received the intimation of her danger with true greatness of soul. She gave orders that every lady of her bedchamber, every maid of honour, nay, every menial servant who had not had the smallpox, should instantly leave Kensington House. She locked herself up during a short time in her closet, burned some papers, arranged others, and then calmly awaited her fate. During 2 or 3 days there were many alternations of hope and fear. The physicians contradicted each other and themselves in a way which sufficiently indicates the state of medical science in that age. The disease was measles. It was scarlet fever. It was spotted fever. It was erysipelas. At one moment some symptoms, which in truth showed that the case was almost hopeless, were hailed as indications of returning health. At length all doubt was over. Radcliffe's opinion proved to be right. It was plain that the Queen was sinking under smallpox of the most malignant type. At this time William remained night and day near her bedside. The little couch on which he slept when he was in camp was spread for him in the antechamber, but he scarcely lay down on it. The sight of his misery, the Dutch envoy wrote, was enough to melt the hardest heart. Nothing seemed to be left of the man whose serene fortitude had been the wonder of old soldiers on the disastrous day of Landen, and of old sailors on that fearful night among the sheets of ice and banks of sand on the coast of Goree. The very domestics saw the tears running unchecked down that face, of which the stern composure had seldom been disturbed by any triumph or by any defeat. Several of the prelates were in attendance. The King drew Burnet aside, and gave way to an agony of grief. "There is no hope," he cried. "I was the happiest man on earth, and I am the most miserable. She had no fault, none. You knew her well, but you could not know, nobody but myself could know, her goodness." Tennyson undertook to tell her that she was dying. He was afraid that such a communication, abruptly made, might agitate her violently, and began with much management. But she soon caught his meaning, and, with that gentle womanly courage which so often puts our bravery to shame, submitted herself to the will of God. She called for a small cabinet in which her most important papers were locked up, gave orders that, as soon as she was no more, it should be delivered to the King, and then dismissed worldly cares from her mind. She received the Eucharist. and repeated her part of the office with unimpaired memory and intelligence, though in a feeble voice. She observed that Tennyson had been long standing at her bedside, and, with that sweet courtesy which was habitual to her, faltered out her commands that he should sit down, and repeated them till he obeyed. After she had received the sacrament, she sank rapidly, and uttered only a few broken words. Twice she tried to take a last farewell of him whom she had loved so truly and entirely, but she was unable to speak. He had a succession of fits so alarming that his privy councillors, who were assembled in a neighbouring room, were apprehensive for his reason and his life. The Duke of Leeds, at the request of his colleagues, ventured to assume the friendly guardianship of which minds deranged by sorrow stand in need. A few minutes before the Queen expired, William was removed, almost insensible, from the sick room. Mary died in peace with Anne. Before the physicians had pronounced the case hopeless, the Princess, who was then in very delicate health, had sent a kind message, and Mary had returned a kind answer. The Princess had then proposed to come herself, but William had, in very gracious terms, declined the offer. The excitement of an interview, he said, would be too much for both sisters. If a favourable turn took place, Her Royal Highness should be most welcome to Kensington. A few hours later, all was over. The public sorrow was great and general. For Mary's blameless life, her large charities, and her winning manners had conquered the hearts of her people. When the Commons next met, they sat for a time in profound silence. At length it was moved and resolved that an address of condolence should be presented to the King, and then the House broke up without proceeding to any other business. The Dutch envoy informed the States General that many of the members had handkerchiefs at their eyes. The number of sad faces in the street struck every observer. The mourning was more general than even the mourning for Charles the Second had been. On the Sunday which followed the Queen's death, her virtues were celebrated in almost every parish church of the capital, and in almost every great meeting of Nonconformists. The most estimable Jacobites respected the sorrow of William and the memory of Mary. But to the fiercer zealots of the party neither the house of mourning nor the grave was sacred. At Bristol the adherents of Sir John Knight rang the bells as if for a victory. It has often been repeated, and is not at all improbable, that a nonjuring divine in the midst of the general lamentation preached on the text, "Go, see now this cursed woman, and bury her, for she is a king's daughter." It is certain that some of the ejected priests pursued her to the grave with invectives. Her death, they said, was evidently a judgment for her crime. God had, from the top of Sinai, and thunder and lightning, promised length of days to children who should honour their parents, and in this promise was plainly implied a menace. What father had ever been worse treated by his daughters than James by Mary and Anne? Mary was gone, cut off in the prime of life, in the glow of beauty, in the height of prosperity, and Anne would do well to profit by the warning. Wagstaff went further, and dwelt much on certain wonderful coincidences of time. James had been driven from his palace and country in Christmas week. Mary had died in Christmas week. There could be no doubt that, if the secrets of Providence were disclosed to us, we should find that the turns of the daughter's complaint in December 1694 bore an exact analogy to the turns of the father's fortune in December 1688. It was at midnight that the father ran away from Rochester. It was at midnight that the daughter expired. Such was the profundity and such the ingenuity of a writer whom the Jacobite schismatics justly regarded as one of their ablest chiefs. The Whigs soon had an opportunity of retaliating. They triumphantly related that a scrivener in the borough, a staunch friend of hereditary right, while exulting in the judgment which had overtaken the Queen, had himself fallen down dead in a fit. The funeral was long remembered as the saddest and most august that Westminster had ever seen. While the Queen's remains lay in state at Whitehall, The neighbouring streets were filled every day, from sunrise to sunset, by crowds which made all traffic impossible. The two houses, with their maces, followed the hearse. The lords robed in scarlet and ermine, the commons in long black mantles. No preceding sovereign had ever been attended to the grave by a Parliament, for, till then, the Parliament had always expired with the sovereign. A paper had indeed been circulated in which the logic of a small sharp pettifogger was employed to prove that writs, issued in the joint names of William and Mary, ceased to be of force as soon as William reigned alone. But this paltry cavil had completely failed. It had not even been mentioned in the lower house, and had been mentioned in the upper, only to be contemptuously overruled. The whole magistracy of the city swelled the procession. The banners of England and France, Scotland and Ireland, were carried by great nobles before the corpse. The pall was borne by the chiefs of the illustrious houses of Howard, Seymour, Grey, and Stanley. On the gorgeous coffin of purple and gold were laid the crown and sceptre of the realm. The day was well suited to such a ceremony. The sky was dark and troubled, and a few ghastly flakes of snow fell on the black plumes of the funeral car. Within the abbey, nave, choir, and transept were in a blaze with innumerable wax-lights. The body was deposited under a magnificent canopy in the centre of the church, while the primate preached. The earlier part of his discourse was deformed by pedantic divisions and subdivisions, but towards the close he told what he himself had seen and heard, with a simplicity and earnestness more affecting than the most skilful rhetoric. Through the whole ceremony the distant booming of cannon was heard every minute from the batteries of the Tower. The gentle Queen sleeps among her illustrious kindred in the southern aisle of the chapel of Henry the 7th. The affection with which her husband cherished her memory was soon attested by a monument the most superb that was ever erected to any sovereign. No scheme had been so much her own, none had been so near her heart, as that of converting the palace at Greenwich into a retreat for seamen. It had occurred to her, when she had found it difficult to provide good shelter and good attendance for the thousands of brave men who had come back to England wounded after the battle of La Hogue. While she lived, scarcely any step was taken toward the accomplishing of her favourite design. But it should seem that, as soon as her husband had lost her, he began to reproach himself for having neglected her wishes. No time was lost. A plan was furnished by Wren, and soon an edifice, surpassing that asylum which the magnificent Lewis had provided for his soldiers, rose on the margin of the Thames. Whoever reads the inscription which runs round the frieze of the hall will observe that William claims no part of the merit of the design, and that the praise is ascribed to Mary alone. Had the King's life been prolonged till the works were completed, a statue of her who was the real foundress of the institution would have had a conspicuous place in the court, which presents two lofty domes and two graceful colonnades to the multitudes who are perpetually passing up and down the imperial river. But that part of the plan was never carried into effect, and few of those who gaze on the noblest of European hospitals are aware that it is a memorial of the virtues of the good Queen Mary, of the love and sorrow of William, and of the great victory of La Hogue. End of section 15. End of chapter 20 of the History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay.